The United States, a country often seen as a symbol of freedom. But in Utah, throwing a snowball can be considered armed assault. Meanwhile, in Florida, selling hot dogs while wearing inappropriate clothing could land you in trouble. From quirky laws that are still in effect to absurd bans that have become legends, every state has its own way of deciding what's acceptable and what's not. So, are you ready to be surprised, laugh, or maybe think twice before honking your horn in front of a sandwich shop in Little Rock? If you're feeling hungry in Little Rock, Arkansas, and stop by a sandwich shop late at night, don't even think about honking your horn to get someone's attention. There's a law that prohibits honking in front of sandwich shops at night. In the past, customers would often honk their horns to call employees or friends inside the shop. The problem? It happened late at night, disturbing nearby residents with loud honking. To maintain peace in the neighborhood, this rule was put in place. If you're in Boulder, Colorado, better control your temper and watch your words. That's because saying something that could provoke a fight is actually illegal here. This rule is based on the fighting words doctrine in U.S. law, that speech intended to incite physical violence can be considered a legal offense. Boulder police have the authority to take action against anyone who deliberately uses provocative language that could start a brawl. No matter how important your message is, don't whisper in church if you're in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware. This is an actual law recorded in local regulations, designed to maintain the peace and sacred atmosphere of church services. The rule was introduced to ensure that places of worship remain undisturbed during religious ceremonies. While whispering might seem harmless, in a sacred space, it can be considered disrespectful. Planning to sell hot dogs in Fort Lauderdale, Florida? Make sure you dress neatly and appropriately. The city enforces strict public decency regulations, especially for street food vendors. This rule specifically targets hot dog vendors, who often operate in tourist areas and downtown districts. It was introduced as part of the city's effort to maintain a clean and professional image. In the past, some hot dog sellers wore revealing or eccentric outfits to attract more customers. In Gainesville, Georgia, known as the poultry capital of the world, there's a unique rule. Fried chicken must be eaten with your hands. And no, this isn't just a myth. In 1961, Gainesville officially passed a law banning the use of forks when eating fried chicken. The reasoning? Tradition and respect for the cultural way of enjoying fried chicken, which is meant to be eaten by hand. Originally, this law was introduced as a light-hearted tourism gimmick, but it remains part of the city's official regulations. In fact, in 2009, a tourist was symbolically arrested for breaking the rule by using a fork. But don't worry, it was all just for fun. Believe it or not, in Hawaii, placing a coin in your ear can actually be considered illegal. This unusual law is said to be related to safety concerns and child protection. In the past, putting small objects like coins in the ear was seen as dangerous, as it could lead to injuries or infections. While this law technically still exists, it's not actively enforced and remains more of a historical leftover than a rule people follow today. This might just be one of the funniest laws in America. In Pocatello, Idaho, it is illegal to frown excessively. So, if you're in a bad mood here, you might want to control your facial expressions, or risk being in violation of the law. This bizarre rule dates back to the 1950s, when Pocatello was hit by a severe snowstorm. To boost community morale, local officials passed a law aimed at promoting happiness. Technically, the law still exists, though no one enforces it anymore. Instead, Pocatello has embraced the fun side of the rule and even calls itself the U.S. Smile Capital. Is it a privilege or just a practical rule? In Illinois, culinary students under 21 years old are legally allowed to taste wine as part of their coursework. This law, known as Sip and Spit, is part of Illinois legislation that permits underage culinary students to sample wine, but with strict conditions. They must be supervised by an instructor and are not allowed to swallow the wine. The idea behind this law is simple. To become a professional chef, one must understand the taste and aroma of different ingredients, including wine, which is commonly used in cooking or paired with certain dishes. If you're strolling through a public park in Beech Grove, Indiana, be careful if you're carrying a watermelon. There's an old law that bans people from eating watermelon in the city park. This rule was originally created due to concerns about littering and safety. In the past, people would carelessly discard watermelon rinds, making the park dirty and slippery. Reports suggest that discarded rinds frequently caused people to slip and fall, leading to accidents. Additionally, the juicy fruit attracted insects, making the park less pleasant. As a result, this law was introduced to maintain cleanliness and safety in public spaces. If you find yourself in Harper Woods, Michigan, don't even think about painting a sparrow or coating one with any kind of paint. It may sound bizarre, but this is an actual law in the local regulations. This rule was created to protect sparrows and other wild birds from exploitation and abuse. In the past, reports surfaced of people painting sparrows to sell them or simply for amusement. Perhaps they thought a brightly colored bird would be more attractive. However, this practice was deemed cruel, as paint can damage a bird's feathers and overall health. To prevent such mistreatment, Harper Woods officially banned painting or dyeing wild birds. If you're ever in Mississippi and happen to see an elephant, do not offer it beer. Believe it or not, there's a real law that prohibits anyone from giving beer to an elephant in this state. This regulation falls under the laws governing exotic animals, particularly circus elephants, which were once common in Mississippi. Decades ago, traveling circuses frequently brought elephants to town, and there were incidents where spectators or even trainers gave them alcohol. Reportedly, intoxicated elephants became unruly and difficult to control, leading to public disturbances. Eventually, this law was put in place to prevent drunken elephants from causing chaos. This might sound strange, but there was once an old law in certain parts of New Mexico that banned people from carrying lunchboxes. Although this rule is no longer enforced, it did exist at one time. The law was originally linked to security concerns in schools and government buildings. In the past, officials feared that lunchboxes could be used to smuggle contraband or other dangerous items. Decades ago, there were cases where lunchboxes were used to sneak in alcohol, small weapons, or other prohibited goods. Additionally, some schools in New Mexico implemented policies requiring students to purchase meals from the cafeteria, aiming to regulate nutrition and hygiene standards. Snowball fights are fun, right? Well, not in Utah, where throwing a snowball can actually be considered illegal use of a weapon. This rule is part of a broader law regarding objects that can cause injury, and yes, snowballs are included. In the past, children and teenagers frequently threw snowballs at passing cars, house windows, or even unsuspecting pedestrians. Some incidents resulted in property damage or serious injuries, especially when snowballs were thrown too hard or contained chunks of ice. Because of this, snowballs were classified under projectiles or dangerous weapons, making them subject to legal restrictions. If you accidentally hit a deer while driving in West Virginia, don't worry, it's not a crime. In fact, the state allows residents to take the animal home for food if they wish. This law was introduced to reduce waste and prevent decaying animals from causing foul odors on the roads. It's also seen as a practical way to make use of edible meat rather than letting it go to waste. Of course, any roadkill intended for consumption must be inspected first to ensure it's safe to eat. This regulation is still in effect today, and some areas even have specific procedures for reporting and obtaining permission to take home roadkill. If you're in Wilbur, Washington, be careful when riding a horse, because an old law once banned riding an ugly horse in this town. While this rule is no longer enforced, it was originally created during Wilbur's early ranching days. Back then, horses were not just a means of transportation, but also a source of pride and a status symbol. During the Wild West era, a healthy, well-groomed horse was considered an essential asset. A horse that appeared malnourished, lame, or sick was seen as a sign of neglect by its owner, or even a safety hazard on the town's roads. Every law, no matter how strange, comes from history, traditions, and the values of a community. Some were made to maintain order, others emerged from unusual past events, and some were created to protect personal freedoms, from banning watermelon in parks to dress codes for hot dog vendors. These quirky US laws highlight the diversity of American culture and how each state has its own way of governing daily life. This is the face of freedom in America, varied yet still shaped by unique boundaries that reflect its people's identity.